Britain is facing the most unpredictable and possibly the most important election of my lifetime. It could decide the future relationship of this country with the European Union, and it could even decide whether the UK remains a united kingdom. Neither Conservatives nor Labour look like winning an outright majority. But Europe is one issue which seems to really divide them. David Cameron wants to renegotiate Britain's terms of membership and then have a referendum on whether the country stays in the European Union. Ed Miliband thinks that would be a reckless gamble and very bad for Britain's business. I'm with George Parker, the FT's political editor. George, who do you think's winning the argument, and do the voters care?
Well, that assumes there is an argument going on in this election campaign, and the truth is that Europe, probably the most important issue at the heart of this election, is not being discussed by any of the main political leaders at all. So it's hard to establish who's winning the argument. The only people really talking about it are the UK Independence Party, and that's precisely why the two main parties, Labour and the Conservatives, don't want to talk about the European Union.
And yet it does matter, which is why we're going to talk about it. First, let's have a look at it this way. If David Cameron wins, what sort of changes is he going to try to get?
First of all, he wants to protect the position of the United Kingdom in the single market as a country which is outside the Eurozone, against the potential of the Eurozone acting as a powerful bloc against the interests of the UK. Immigration is another important issue. He wants to address what he calls the pull factors of immigration to this country by restricting the rights of migrant workers to the British welfare system. That's potentially very controversial. And then some other totemic things. He wants to, for example, take Britain out of the EU's guiding mission of ever closer union. He wants to give the House of Parliament here slightly more control over the laws coming out of the European Union. My impression with David Cameron is that he wants to make this sound like an enormous package which will transform the relationship between the UK and the rest of the European Union, but in fact coming up with demands which are actually achievable and negotiable, because in the end he wants, I'm convinced, to campaign for Britain to stay inside the European Union. He needs to declare his own negotiation a success.
But it strikes me that he faces a real danger. He wants to raise expectations here that it's a big deal, but he mustn't ask for so much from his European partners that they say, I'm sorry, no special deals, you are actually a member of the club.
Well, precisely, and he's already had difficult conversations with Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, who said, look, if you're talking about changing the EU's rules on free movement of people, that's off the table. We're not going to do that. That's a founding principle of the EU. So David Cameron's in a position where he has to make these demands sound like it's going to be transformative, and we have experience of that. If you think back to the 1975 British referendum on whether we should stay part of what was then the European Economic Community, Harold Wilson came up with a set of negotiations which actually didn't amount to very much, but he presented it as a great negotiating triumph. David Cameron will do exactly the same thing because he knows the parameters of what he can achieve, particularly given the very short timetable he set himself. He wants a referendum by the end of 2017. It has to be realistic.
He's got a problem too with this whole issue of freedom of movement, because that's a big issue in the election. That's to say UKIP says we don't want all these migrants coming from Eastern Europe to Britain. David Cameron, if he's trying to restrict freedom of movement, is immediately going to run into hostility from all those Central and East European countries for whom that's a fundamental part of the game.
Immigration is the single aspect of this election campaign which has a direct bearing on the European Union. It's why Nigel Farage, the leader of UKIP, talks about it, because immigration is a way in the jargon of weaponising the European Union as an issue. Now, as you say, David Cameron has already alienated potential allies in Central and Eastern Europe by talking about restricting access, and he's particularly mentioned Polish migrant workers claiming child benefit for children living back in Poland. So he's got a problem there. I think what he's trying to achieve here is he's trying to impose restrictions on the British welfare system which go with the grain of the debate in other, particularly Western European countries. So Germany is adopting the same kind of things. There are the restrictions on access to the welfare system in places like Belgium and France and the Netherlands as well.
Okay, now he wants then to have a referendum in Britain with a clear in-out question. Are we going to stay a member or are we going to leave? That's a very popular thing on the whole for voters. Is Ed Miliband not taking a huge risk when he says, I won't have a referendum, it's reckless?
If you look at the UK debate on Europe from the outside Britain, you think we spend our whole time obsessing about the European Union. You know, it's on the front page of newspapers, but in fact the public don't really care that much about the European Union. If you look at the list of issues they care about this election, Europe usually comes in round about number 15 or number 20. So it's not a big issue, it's not a major risk for Ed Miliband. And for Ed Miliband, by saying we aren't going to put Britain's membership of the European Union at risk. It's one of the few policies where the Labour Party is able to say to the business community, which generally wants Britain to stay in, look, we're on your side. So I think the risk for Ed Miliband in opposing a referendum is limited.
And what about the City of London? Doesn't it really matter to the City of London? Because if we're outside an integrated Eurozone, won't they be out in the cold?
It's a huge issue for the City of London. That's one of the reasons why we know the city is determined for Britain to stay in. It's opposed to the uncertainty created by a referendum. The truth is that if Britain's outside of the European Union, we'll still be forced to abide by the same rules to get access to the single market in financial services, but we'd still be bound by those rules, but we'd have absolutely no say in the way they're drawn up. And that would be disastrous for the City of London, because we've seen small instances where countries in the Eurozone have tried to tilt the rules more in their favour to try to get more business into Paris and Frankfurt.
What about the role of the Scottish National Party? Because if there's a British referendum and the English were to vote to leave Europe, wouldn't the Scottish have another referendum and vote to stay in Europe and leave the UK?
Scotland, by and large, is a pro-European country. All the opinion polls say that Scots would like to stay in the European Union. Now, if there's a referendum in 2017 where Britain votes to leave, with the English voters saying leave, Scottish voters saying we want to stay in the European Union, that would almost certainly trigger demands from the Scottish National Party in Edinburgh for another referendum on Scottish independence, that Scotland wants to stay in the European Union. It's not going to be dragged out of Europe by its English counterparts, and that could have a lasting and potentially disastrous consequence for the UK.
Which is why this election really matters. We're going to be discussing this on April the 29th at the FT at the start of a Future of Europe series, particularly looking at Britain and Europe. And George, you'll be there, so I look forward to that very much. This is Quentin Peel for the Financial Times in London.